Welcome back to the panel discussion, Cyber Warfare, Securing Our Nation's Defense, sponsored by Tenable Network Security on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Greg Garcia, the Chief Information Officer of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Dr. Ray Latier, the Chief of Cybersecurity Division C4 Department for the Marine Corps, Paul Morris, the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer for the Transportation Security Administration, and Matt Alderman, the Vice President of Strategy for Tenable Network Security. I want to pick back up where we left off from that last segment when we talked about automation a fair amount. I think, as Matt said, this is the nirvana. This is where agencies, organizations, people are trying to head toward because, again, it frees up so much. Let me turn to Ray to start and talk a little about automation. How is the Marine Corps looking at automation?
And thank you for that. And I agree with what Matt is saying. Is we've got to move towards this way. It's always been nirvana. How do we take and automate this? We actually had a successful test working with the Air Force about 3 years ago out of Camp Lejeune, where we did take the systems, identify a particular network access control capability, isolated the systems, and using particular tools and such, we're able to scan the system, identify what the deltas were, what the requirements were, automatically patch, remediate, and test the system to bring it up before it was even allowed to be connected onto the network. The beautiful thing about this was it took only 45 seconds to get it done. That's been the biggest issue we've had before, is it takes so long. In this, we're able to maintain, for that period of 3 months, over a 98% compliance rate. Now, again, that's the aspect of the measure, but the compliance says I have to have all my patches done. I have to have my security technical implementation guide standards met. I have to be able to see what the standards are. And in this, it takes away from people trusting that the system's operating there in the corner without anybody validating it, to have the system constantly reporting to me locally what's going on. Here's the part of the nirvana. We've always said in contracts, we've always said, as we always couch ourselves, well, I have a 93% assurance, maybe we can get 85%. Honest to goodness, I actually had one day in August of 2012 when I had a report, and I was looking at the constant report from Lejeune, and we had 100% compliance on all 3,200 systems we had out there. Now, it only lasted about an hour, but the idea was the possibility is there. So we're starting to do that with the DoD. We're starting to move into that. The Marine Corps is moving out to start to get these things established on our bases and our stations and our camps, so we can be able to start automating this process to get ourselves up to that particular aspect of compliance. And instead of having to roll this data up to another repository as part of the continuous diagnostics and mitigation central repository, it could just push the data, the status itself. So now I'm not moving data up from one location into another one. I'm just exposing it into a web location, so anybody who is authorized or need to have that transparency can see it that way. Now I'm reducing the traffic flow into the network as well. It's there. It's maybe it's nirvana of the approach, but we are actually closer than we've ever been before.
So I want to move over to Paul, but before I do that, so this was a test 3 years ago.
Of about, and it's about...
the reporter in me has to ask, so
Sure.
What have you done for me lately?
Well, the thing is, we've maintained it there. It's just not been as advanced as it's supposed to be until recently. And we got some support from the DoD and from Headquarters Marine Corps to actually fund it to expand it across the entire Marine Corps.
And that's
where we're going right now.
With this kind of concept?
Yes.
Excellent. Ray, Paul, jump in now from TSA's perspective.
That's nirvana. I mean, really, that's what CDM's supposed to do, is to give me instantaneous, always knowing, always patching, keeping the rogue actors off my network. And every agency or system out there is different. Ours is a patchwork of different contract, different vendors, different expectations of legacy equipment that come together. And I think getting over the first set of hurdles is, besides knowing what you have, is all of the tools that we've inherited now, all the security tools, don't work and play well with each other. They create data, and some is looked at by our network operations team, some's looked at by the SOC, some are not looked at all. But our effort here is we're actually trying to build essentially that security data model that will define really where we're going is to a metadata catalog of where was the data, where did it come from, and then tying that to who needs to see it or what needs to see it to make sure they have that access. So we're starting at the base level of we're going to do that, and then as we start to work and play well with vendors of, well, you're going to fit in here. And then we need to piece those vendors together, and it's an integration effort. It's I need to be able to leverage what my network monitoring is showing out at an airport to immediate remediation from here, and how do you work that together? So that's one of the biggest challenges. And then the other piece, which you talked about so well, which is our compliance reporting requirements are just huge. And that defines what we measure and really how we behave in some way. And right now we're drowning in Excel spreadsheets to kind of move that into an understandable. But what I want to be able to do, and we're heading that direction, is with some tools that we're putting in, is to be able to reduce the time that we gather. We can look at it, and then I can push it out to those system owners and security officers soon enough so they can take action instead of waiting 2 months for that report to filter out from heaven. So those are, again, it's everyone's different, but bringing them in together, and legacy's a big issue there.
So we're going to look at Matt on this one, because you talk about integration at the command level. What about you products?
Yeah, I mean, this has been, this has been talked about for over 15 years, probably closer to 20 back in the days. I remember the whole interconnected framework, right? We never got there. I think part of the reason we haven't gotten there is we all fight for a very small portion of the security budget, right? So even though we don't really compete, we compete because we're competing for dollars, right? Security has always been a small portion of the budget, so what you don't see is, I think, a lot of integration across the different product sets. And I think that is critical if we're going to solve the bigger problem. What I've typically seen, and this is a perfect example, is you build the big data repository, right? You're pulling all the data. Since the tools don't integrate well together, you have to build your own repository of bringing that data together to start to drive analytics, and then you're going to put that interface on top that allows you to drive action. That's the natural progression of what most have done. It starts with the human element of kind of the incident response, eventually Nirvana to the protection side. As an industry, yes, I think we have to continue to work together and really figure out how to integrate our different data elements. We're starting to see some of that with standards around taxi and sticks for sharing threat intelligence data. More of that kind of interchange, I think, will help do that, but we're also going to need some folks to kind of help drive some of that, because I don't think we'll do it natively ourselves as an industry.
And I think that's where the government's got to come in, as Paul talked about, the metadata catalog. Hey, here, meet this. If you can't, well, then don't play in my sandbox.
Right.
So let me turn to Greg for a second. Greg, jump in about this,
Yep.
The idea not just of automation, but also of security controls more generally.
I think one of the things that we might be missing here is the shift away of ownership, right? So we also have to remember that the federal government is driving towards the cloud, which is a not owned set of equipment. So we've got to partner with the cloud providers to give us that visibility and that compliance. So those that rely on personally controlling, I mean, one of the things we've all seen is that we've talked before about virtual desktop as a service, is you've got to reduce the variables of risk. So if your strategy is I'm going to patch 10,000 machines, and those 10,000 machines are an island among themselves, and when are they all aligned to get that 100%? That's going to be very complex and expensive. If you can say it's one image that's pushed down to 1,000 machines at the point of consumption, your exposure is a completely different problem set, and much more effective and efficient that way. And when we talk about servers, we talk about computing capability, storage capability. If that is all where it's supposed to be going is towards the cloud, is we're going to have to think about new relationships with those vendors to provide that requisite security. We haven't really talked about the insider threat yet. That's another big part of this. We've talked about, another thing we haven't talked about is heuristics, right? The behavior that's normal. You may not have a network anomaly, but it's the user within a profile that's acceptable. Just because they technically can do it, is it something that they should be doing? So these are all iterations of excellence that we have to work towards in a cohesive fashion. So these parts are really critical, the integration of that cyber capability. It's just not about machines, it's just not about ownership, it's about the unity and intersections of all those elements.
Sounds like, Matt, Greg wants you to do another panel. So talk to me a little bit more about
on cloud. I'd love to.
Cloud insider threat. Oh,
but I mean, he's right. The federal government is starting to get there, but we're already seeing it in this commercial side. As we move our data centers from federal or corporate-owned data centers to the cloud, the shift of controls are going to happen. No longer, I think, in the future will we need to worry about things like host, network, or perimeter controls. They're going to be embedded into the cloud service providers, but you need visibility into those controls as part of the overall process. Because even though you're outsourcing the function of IT, you're not outsourcing the risk. You still own the risk profile, right? And so you're going to see that shift in the controls, I think, when you get to the infrastructure. It also makes other things a little easier when we get into automation, because if we think about what cloud has allowed us to do with DevOps and application development, it now makes it really easy to build a new image with the patch in it and literally deploy it almost instantaneously. And that's where we get to that kind of longer term automation, is cloud will actually help drive some of that, because it'll be easy for us to literally blow those systems away, spin them back up with a new image that's secure, and off we go.
It's important. It gets back to this giving the standards out to the industry. This is exciting to talk about the idea of how do I take and give a standard virtual image and how to develop off of that virtual image. We just started a codathon. We're trying to get some of our Marines to kind of get into work on developing some mobile applications, but basing it upon a standard secure image. Now, once that's distributed to the vendor, you want to come build in my world, you want to come do my work, you want to run this on your servers in your cloud environment someplace else. This is the image. This is what you have to build to. This is what has to be maintained. It's going to be kind of interesting to see how contracts are going to develop on that, because as was talked about earlier, but Paul is that chasing some of the issues in the contract environment. If we're going to move in this commercial environment, we've got to have certain SLAs and contract language that, one, assures the transparency, but also assures accountability. Because we've lived through, in the Navy and Marine Corps, our experience with NMCI. Learned a lot of great things with it. I mean, I'll be balanced. It was interesting. It exposed a lot of issues, but it also exposed some concerns that if we want to have relationships again with commercial entities in this, there's got to be that balance on this thing that we can say, okay, vendor, we're going to hold you accountable for this too.
Right.
I think what we also absolutely have to do is, so the source of a lot of our great capability does not only reside in the federal networks, but it resides in private networks. Those individual companies that have that data, that develop great weapon systems or great capabilities, also must be accountable and responsible to protect the data there. Because we can protect the data in a government network superbly, and if we put it out into a place that our partner with industry that doesn't protect it, then it doesn't really matter. So the end game has to be protection when the intellectual property is created, when it's in use, and when it's repository, because that has to be end-to-end protected, because they'll go to where the weakest link is.
And that takes us actually back around to the SCADA conversation, because if you think about it, 88% of all the critical infrastructure is run by the private sector. There's a, if you will, profit motive for the private sector to protect those systems. Now, that profit motive has got to be strong enough to do a better job or do a good enough job. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to go back down the list. I think we started with Ray on the beginnings, and we ended with Matt. So we're going to start with Greg on this side and just work our way down the table. We talk a lot about the holistic cybersecurity, automation, a lot of bits and pieces we've talked about. Bringing it all together now, advice, concept, what's the message you're leaving with?
I think the three strongest words are engagement, resources, and then commitment to support the mission. You absolutely have to engage all your partners. This is not a solo mission. It has to be a team sport. And as the threat ebbs and flows, you need to have a quick sharing of intel. What's the shifting to today? What was it tomorrow? What will be tomorrow? The next day, and then really resource this in the sense of intellectual capital, the combination of tools. The workforce. We haven't even talked about the workforce yet. The workforce is probably one of the greatest weaknesses and greatest strengths we have in cyber, because I believe they're in high demand and low density, and finding a cyber-relevant, cyber-trained workforce is one of the most critical things we can do, and then really just committing to accomplish the mission.
Ray, give me about 45 seconds.
Sure. I'd say I would leave the message, we've got to get back to the basics. It is seriously about the humans, about doing things we're supposed to do. Don't click on the link. Know what we're supposed to do. Change the passwords. I mean, it may sound kind of
Hygienic.
Well,
hygienic.
yeah. We're actually getting point. It's got to be the communication too. I've been tasked. I've got to create a cyber hygiene course now for our new Marines to teach them. Look, you know what you have. This is the age of the digital natives. We've got to teach. These are certain things you have to remember to do to take care of yourself as well as take care of us. So that means there's the communication part we have to have very clear of what their expectations are, and then assure that there's transparency of what's going on, and most importantly, accountability. If someone's going to do something great, golly, or reward them. Give them the recognition. Contrary, if someone has done something wrong, they need to be held accountable, and need to be held accountable quickly, so that the word gets out. We shouldn't be doing that.
Paul.
I think the last couple of things I would say is that, we've talked a lot about really some almost like a static system, but, we're running into several cloud environments right now. We're being pushed by our mobile workforce. They want data, where they are on the device they have. And that's pushing us to really think about, I think, identity and where that data flows in and out of our system. So that really goes into this challenge that we have in trying to make sure that we're protected. The last thing is overlaying what we know about intelligence. I go back to what Matt was talking about these layers. We took the cyber kill chain and laid it across our incident response based on other agencies' big hacks and say, if it got passed through the first couple of layers, would we see it? Could we respond to it at that layer? And how would we change an environment? And that's driving the things that we buy, the processes we put in place, and it's really the foundation of some of our incident response. So there's a lot of work to do here, and that's what I'll end with.
All right. Matt, you get the last word.
To me, it's all about capabilities, not tools. The tools will shift because we're going to have legacy systems migrating to new cloud-based systems, and the old tools won't address the new technology. So we've got to get out of this habit of just chasing the silver bullet tool. We really have to look at what are the capabilities I need to protect my environment and continually evolve that as we adopt these new technologies, because cloud, mobile, cloud-based applications, they're going to change the way we have to address security in the future. And if we're only focused on tools, we're never going to get ahead of this threat.
All right. Unfortunately, that we're out of time. We could talk longer. Greg outlined maybe 6 or 7 other topics we could have gone through, but we'll have to do this save it for another time. I'd like to thank our guests today: Greg Garcia, the Chief Information Officer at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers; Dr. Ray Latier, the Marine Corps' Chief of Cybersecurity Division, C4 Department; Paul Morris, the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer at the Transportation Security Administration; and Matt Alderman, the Vice President of Strategy for Tenable Network Security. I'm your host, Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the panel discussion, Cyber Warfare, Securing Our Nation's Defense, sponsored by Tenable Network Security on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com and search Tenable.
On behalf of Tenable Network Security, thank you for joining us. A link for the recorded session will be sent to you shortly. If you requested a training certificate, you will also receive an email with download instructions after the webinar. This concludes our webinar. Thank you.